What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christopher from the Duran, and I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. And today we're going to be talking about America being part of one of three great powers. So, Alexander, I said that the U.S. is one of three great powers, those great powers being China and Russia, along with the U.S. being the three great powers. And I say this, this is not my admission of this or my knowledge of this. This is actually the U.S. admitting to this, and specifically the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review, the document that came out, I believe, on the 8th of February. You wrote about it, where they come to the admission that America is no longer a unipolar hyperpower, superpower, but it's one of three great powers now, vying for influence in various regions: the South China Sea, the Middle East. You can throw in Ukraine, Europe. Talk to us about this document that came out in February and connect it to why it's relevant today.
I think that was an absolutely revolutionary moment, that when that document was published, and it's not received anywhere near the amount of attention that it deserved. Can I explain why? What that document said, it starts out, it says that since 2010, great power competition has returned. Now, great power competition was what we had during the Cold War. During the Cold War, there was the great power rivalry was between the United States and the Soviet Union. Those are the two great alliances that existed, the two great powers that existed at that time. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States was left by itself as the only remaining great power. And we had, during the 1990s, a period that was called the unipolar moment. There was only one pole, and that was the United States, because it was so much more powerful than all the other states that it was essentially able not only to do as it liked, but basically to decide the entire course of international relations. Now, what this document did, and it was published, it must be stressed, by the Pentagon, in other words, by the US military, it said that this period has ended. There are now great powers again, analogous in military and economic power to the United States. China is one, Russia, somewhat differently, is another. The United States has to work with those powers. Those powers are in competition with the United States. They're vying for influence with the United States. We are back, in other words, to the old balance of power politics which existed previously, and the United States is no longer the world hegemonic power that it was for a certain period during the 1990s and the 2000s. Now, that is a revolutionary admission from the United States. And if you think about what Donald Trump is doing, meeting with the Russians in a few weeks in Helsinki, that is a direct product of that recognition in the United States, not just by Donald Trump, but by people around him, like John Bolton, like Henry Kissinger, and by the US military, that the United States now needs to negotiate on an equal basis with other powers.
Okay, I'm going to get into two hot areas of conflict where these three powers are converging. And the first one is, I want you to address power geopolitics, and the first area is Syria. Syria, obviously China is not as involved, but you have the US and Russia. Explain to us how this new thinking from the US military plays into the Syrian conflict.
Right. I think that the essential point to understand about the Syrian conflict is that there was no regime change in Syria, and President Assad's government is now on the brink of victory in Syria because a great power other than the United States intervened in Syria in the Syrian war to win the war for President Assad. That great power was Russia. The United States found, even though it very much wanted to engineer the overthrow of President Assad, that the moment the Russians went into Syria, the option of going to war against Syria to overthrow President Assad's government was no longer workable. Now, that in itself shows that the Russian military is the military of a great power. It is in a position to withstand the United States and to withstand the military of the United States. So that was what changed the political calculus in Syria, the geopolitical calculus in Syria. I think the US military understands this very well. If you look back at what happened in April of this year, when the US did launch a missile strike against Syria, they did everything they possibly could to reassure the Russians that this strike was not directed against the Russians there and that it would not affect the overall situation in Syria in any way. And that was what happened. It was an admission by the United States of weakness relative to the Russians in Syria. So Syria is a good example of what we said, what we were talking about in the earlier segment of this program, that we have moved away from the unipolar moment and back towards great powers and a balance of power between them.
Okay, another area which is a little more broad, and there isn't a real conflict taking place, but it's a very contentious area, especially economically, because of the trade routes that it controls, and that's the South China Sea. So explain to us the power geopolitics and how the U.S. is confronting China in the South China Sea, especially understand that it's not a hegemon or a superpower anymore.
Right. I think the first point I would make is that I actually disagree with you. I think there is a conflict in the South China Sea between the US and China. The difference is it's not yet a war. But of course one can have a conflict without a war. But the other thing I would say, and it is that Syria is important. The South China Sea and what goes on there is far more important, because the South China Sea is as important to China as the Gulf of Mexico is to the United States. It is the most important body of ocean near China. Around half of China's trade, external trade, passes through it. This is an area of immense strategic significance for the Chinese. Now, what the US have been trying to do, and they've been saying this all around the world, and they started saying this most aggressively when the unipolar moment happened after the Soviet Union fell, is that the US fleet is entitled to go wherever it wishes in the world oceans, because the United States defends what the US calls freedom of navigation. Now, of course, if the US fleet is positioned in the South China Sea, so close to China, in an area so vital to China, then of course the US is able to strangle China economically. It could impose a blockade on China. At least that's the theory of it. What is now happening is that the Chinese have responded to that with their own massive naval build-up. They're building 4 aircraft carriers as we're talking. They're going to build a huge fleet, oceanic fleet, in the South China Sea and the Pacific, and the United States is not able to keep up with this.
Now, this document, this review document was written in February, and this whole, at the end of the unipolar moment, was announced in February. So Trump was just, into his presidency. He was just starting on his presidency. How is Trump, someone who's based his entire presidency on America becoming great again, on America winning, how is he going to handle this new reality, this reality of having to deal 3 great powers together, managing the world, sometimes working together, sometimes at conflict? How do you see Trump handling this shift in the balance of power?
Actually, I think he's potentially able to handle it quite well. I mean, the thing to understand about Donald Trump is that his background is that of a businessman. He has, and you see this all the time, people are complaining about this, especially in Europe, he has a transactional approach to foreign policy. I mean, very much like businessmen do. He says, you know, if this is in my economic and financial interest, I will deal with you, I will come to an agreement, and if it's not, then I won't. And I'm not going to base my politics and my policies on abstractions, on values, on things of that kind. I'm going to look at the narrow interests of the United States. Now, strangely enough, I think the Chinese and the Russians potentially can work with that. I think they can understand it because it's practical. It's grounded ultimately in reality. It is grounded in a reality of what US national interests are, which the Russians and the Chinese, who are highly realistic in the way they conduct foreign policy, can understand. It is not grounded in these extraordinary ideas that were being spread around a few years ago and which are still popular with some people in the United States, that the US is this exceptional country that has a right to intervene everywhere because it is the embodiment of the future, and it has not only a right but in some way a duty to carry out change everywhere in order to achieve this future liberal democratic order that the US is supposedly champions. I think the Russians and the Chinese found that idea extremely dangerous and very disturbing, whereas with Donald Trump, I think they can understand him, and I think they could probably come to some sort of arrangement with him if he's allowed to do that and to work with them.
For our viewers watching in the U.S. And our American viewers, there may be a pessimistic kind of undertone to saying, "Oh, we're not the exceptional country anymore." And Obama, I think Obama did a lot of damage to the U.S. by propagating this exceptionalism, both internally and externally. And because when you're exceptional, everyone else is not exceptional; they're below you. And so Obama really drove this exceptionalism and this neoliberal exceptionalism, much to the detriment of the U.S., both at home and abroad. Do you see this sharing of power, even though the U.S. is the most powerful country, but this sharing of power? What are the upsides for the U.S. in this? What are the things that American listeners, American viewers can take away from this conversation and say, you know what, it's good to have some competition and some other great powers, even though they're not as strong as us, but to have some competition in the global scene, and it could actually be a net positive. How would you address that?
I think it would be a net positive, and I think you've touched on some very important points, and I'd just like to develop them. Let's turn first to domestic matters. I think that the United States would benefit hugely from having a good relationship with other countries, because one of the things that would change would be that it would no longer be so committed to this extraordinary ideological construct of liberalism, which is affecting its own domestic politics. We must never forget that. The United States has become this extraordinary liberal state, not because everybody in America wants it to be, but because it is promoting that around the world. So that is one thing. I mean, it opens avenues, other avenues in the United States for the development of US policies. The other thing is, I mean, one has to look at the burdens that the US is carrying. Does the US really want to be involved around the world, running the world in the way that it is? I question whether that makes any kind of sense. And I think that the economic and military burdens on the US and on the military, or the US military especially, and on US military families, has been so destructive. And of course it's distorted the entire way in which the US economy is structured. So if the United States is able to move to a condition of peace, then I think that would be good for the United States in every respect.
Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. I think we're going to leave it there on a positive note, and a note that for all our viewers can take away and just say to themselves, this is a good thing, and Trump may actually be the man rightly positioned to deliver a multipolar world where the U.S. may be the biggest power, but it's going to have to work with other great powers to bring some sort of equity to what's going on in geopolitics and some balance. And I think that's a positive note in the end.
I think so, definitely.
Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, thank you very much for a great analysis. Guys, if you liked this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click that notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a video. And visit the Duran shop. Pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Until next time, take care.